Welcome, everybody, to episode number 2 of the Voluntary Planet podcast. I am your host, Tad Soyland. We finally got together a number 2 episode of the podcast here, and the title of today's podcast is "But Without Government." So, anyways, let's get right into it here. A lot of the times, whenever you are arguing with somebody about, or arguing in favor rather, of a free society, of a stateless society, you're going to hear all kinds of arguments about why it won't work, why having a state is infinitely more advantageous, or at least not as bad as a society without a state, right? So we're going to go into some of the arguments that we see, some of the most common arguments, right? So one of them is crime would run rampant, right? Crime would run rampant. Everybody would be, it'd be a free-for-all. Everybody would be just opportunistic and would care less about other people's rights, right? So there is no guarantee, whether the institution of government is established or not, that bad things can't happen, unfortunately, right? No mortal human being can ever ensure the safety of any other. And while in the short term, immediately after the collapse of government, there will be immoral and opportunistic individuals who will seek to engage in thefts of one kind or another against their fellow man, and that happens regardless of whether government exists or not. In the long run, people will learn to respect the rights of others, either through the natural increase in introspection that would result in the absence of ostensible rulemakers and man's laws, or through the direct and often highly uncomfortable consequences that would manifest after those people would decide to engage in offensive behaviors brought onto them by the actions of their potential victims or their protectors, who would then have no restrictions on their right to self-preservation or the tools they decide to employ in that effort, right? So a lot of places in the world right now, unfortunately, and the U.S. is kind of a slight exception to that, right? Self-defense is frowned upon, and it's actually illegal, and it's a lot of people who engage in self-defense are prosecuted for doing so. Now, that would not happen in a free society, right? Everybody would, be in charge of their own safety. They would be in charge of their own self-preservation, and having no limitation then on what to employ in that effort. Again, just like the slide says, right? People would all of a sudden be a lot more respectful, right? An armed society is a polite society. So you wouldn't see nearly as much crime as you see in some of these places when the potential victims are armed, right? So the whole idea about crime would run rampant in a free society is kind of silly. Additionally, governments are all too happy to inform their subjects that it is not the responsibility of the state to protect the individual. The Supreme Court of the United States government has ruled on numerous occasions that the police are under no obligation to protect anyone from any unwarranted aggression committed by individuals within society. The three most prominent Supreme Court cases that one can point to prove this are DeShaney versus Winnebago County, Warren versus District of Columbia, and Castle Rock versus Gonzalez. Now, all three of those have basically concluded, the judges concluded in all three of those cases, that there is no obligation that the state has to protect any single individual, right? So we'll look here specifically at Warren versus District of Columbia as an example. I won't go into all of them, but basically, in a 4-3 decision, the District of Columbia Court of Appeals affirmed the trial court's dismissal of the complaints against the District of Columbia and individual members of the Metropolitan Police Department based on the public duty doctrine, ruling that the duty to provide public services is owed to the public at large, And absent a special relationship between the police and the individual, no specific legal duty exists. The court thus adopted the trial court's determination that no special relationship existed between the police and the appellants, and therefore no specific legal duty existed between the police and the appellants, right? The obvious exception to this that one can point out, even though the effectiveness of it is questionable, is, for example, the idea of restraining orders, right? So an individual can ask the state to issue a restraining order against another individual who is potentially trying to victimize them, and then there's an expectation of a certain level of protection there. But even still, it's not like there's a constant bodyguard at your side, right, or security sort of detail or security system there in place. But it's just, if this person gets within a certain distance of you or your home, then you can inform the state, and then they can come in and prosecute the person for violating that protection order, right? But absent that, there is no legal duty of any police officer or police force to protect any one individual or group. And so the argument that, crime would run rampant and everybody would be jumping at each other's throats and whatnot, and there would be no police to protect you, there already isn't any police to protect you, right? The job of police, or the way that police works, is a crime happens, and then typically you call them and they show up after everything's over to write down notes and then potentially prosecute the people that have already committed the crime, right? So it's just kind of a moot argument. And here we got Gustave de Molinari, really good quote. Anarchy is no guarantee that some people won't kill, injure, kidnap, defraud, or steal from others, and government is a guarantee that some will, right? Another one. But without government, who will protect property rights? This is a big one. This is a really big one that people struggle with. And what is not understood is that the state is the single largest violator of individual and private property rights in the world. Every year, vast amounts of money get violently stolen from the masses under the guise of taxation and civil asset forfeiture to fund an institution that always promises to deliver a more just, prosperous, and safe society, but always ends up doing the exact opposite, creating a world that is less safe, less prosperous, and unjust. To say that people need government to ensure their right to property is as bizarre as arguing that there needs to be more carjackers in your neighborhood to stop the ongoing carjacking, right? Because government, anything that you can say government does in order to better society, you can equally say that they're just as complicit in doing the opposite to worsen society, if that makes sense. When it comes to protecting property rights, the sky is the limit for how many ways there are to protect the individual, which do not involve the violent enslavement of everybody. There are plenty of solutions that people have come up with that have either been deployed or are yet to be deployed because of too many regulatory, government barriers, right? There's only the police force that the government employs, that the government creates, that you can call, right? 911 is only one phone number, and it only leads to those people that are under the employment of the state. And no other organization is out there that you can actually employ to protect your individual property rights against certain people that might be violating it, and so forth, right? So the state has a monopoly on that market, and you see the fruits of that unfortunate situation, right? So the whole idea that without government, private property rights would be at stake, and they wouldn't be, at any given moment, you'd be afraid that somebody was going to come and steal your property. Well, the main person that you would be afraid of doing that at this point, at this juncture, with our current society, is government, right? Because government is the only institution that has the power to do that. They're the only institution that has the power to kick you out of your house for not paying your property tax. They're the only institution that has the power to coerce you in order to give up your guns, if it were to come to that, right? They're the only institution that's capable of enforcing their own arbitrary laws against you, because they have the monopoly on the use of violent aggression right now, right? And then all the other gangs that are out there, right? All the different mafias, the private sector mafias, right? They don't have nearly as much power in order to do that. So that's another thing that's commonly misunderstood by most people who are in favor of the existence of the state, right? They don't see the injustices caused by it. They only see the positives, the ostensible positives that government ostensibly provides, right? And then continuing on with the whole idea of property rights. In a free society, many organizations and firms would arise with a vested interest in just adjudication and arbitration. Dispute resolution organizations would be a primary method of resolving conflicts of interest. And property disputes, absent a centralized, coercive, and a monopolistic justice system, because again, that's a huge problem as well. These firms operating in a free market would be exposed to all market forces which are responsible for regulating them. Their ability to accurately, fairly, and timely resolve disputes involving the private properties of the individuals who choose to employ them would be the deciding factor for their continued existence and prosperity. Conversely, government justice systems and their courts can never have the same level of incentive, as they are impervious to market forces by nature of their existence. Their existence is wholly and exclusively upon the subjugation and parasitosis of its subjects. Now, those are kind of big words, right? Essentially, when we talk about government, people have no choice as to whether they wish to provide government with their money or not, because you are under the coercion and the subjugation of government, and you have no choice, right? You have to pay taxes or else you go to jail. Whereas in a free society, if we were to have a free market, actual justice system, right? Where you have individual, courts that compete as to how they adjudicate certain conflicts and whatnot. The aforementioned dispute resolution organizations that don't have monopolies, they are forced, if they are indeed in a free and open market, to provide the highest level of actual justice, right? Not the prescribed justice that governments tend to dispense with. Here's another one. Without government, we wouldn't have the internet. This one's kind of bizarre. I've heard this one before, but essentially the argument goes, ARPA created the internet, right? ARPA was a branch of government. Therefore, government, the internet wouldn't exist the way that it is, right? Without government, it wouldn't exist at all. So while the internet was indeed created by the Advanced Research Projects Agency as a project intended to streamline military and interagency communication within the U.S. government, it wouldn't be the immensely useful and paradigm-shifting tool it is now had it not been for the private sector making it the center of socioeconomic interaction it is today. Believers in government also love to proclaim that things like the internet wouldn't exist at all if it weren't for government facilitation. Complete conjecture aside, this assertion is found to be completely baseless after even the slightest contemplation about how markets and human progress work. the internet would very much so exist without government, and it probably would be a lot freer and open marketplace in the absence of it, right? But the way that it is now, the way that it exists now, you have the white market, of course, the gray market, and the black market because of government regulation, because of prohibition, all those kinds of things, right? The war on drugs, etc. But I think it's folly to think that the internet wouldn't exist if it wasn't for government, because it's the useful tool that it is today, not because of government, but in spite of it. Here's a great quote by Larkin Rose. "Those who fight for any government, even if they believe they are fighting for their country, can never achieve freedom and justice, because a ruling class, by its very nature, never wants freedom and justice, even for its own subjects, or it would cease to exist. However noble their motives, and however courageous their actions, ultimately, the only thing government soldiers can ever achieve is subjugation and domination." And if you don't believe so, riddle me this, right? If the troops of any given country, right, just doesn't have to be the United States, but any given country, if they are fighting for freedom, why is it that with every additional year there's less and less freedom to be spoken of? Just something to think about. There would be a power vacuum. The power vacuum argument against anarchy can be summarized as the idea that in the absence of a ruling class, after a former ruling class has collapsed, there would be an inevitable vacuum wherein another tyrant, either foreign or domestic, will fill the gap and the state will continue in perpetuity. This argument is both correct and incorrect. If the will of most people will be the continued enslavement and subjugation of humanity under the guise of law and order, then the result of a collapsed ruling class will likely be the installation of a new ruling class. However, if the will of the people is no longer the perpetual enslavement of themselves and their fellow man, and that will is to endure, the condition of freedom will persist, right? So it's all dependent on what people believe in the long run, right? If the vast majority of people continue to be statists, right, and continue to believe in government and believe in the fallacy and the superstition of authority, right? Oh, of course, have to plug Larkin Rose's book. I guess I don't have it here, but The Most Dangerous Superstition, right? Definitely get that book. Yeah, if people continue to believe that, then the cycle is going to continue, right? The cycle of good men. What is it? Strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men. Right, that cycle is going to continue, and in some ways it probably will continue regardless of whether government exists or not, but it'll be made that much worse if it does. Here's one: statists offer relationship support. He's abusive, he steals from me, he lies. Well, I tell you to dump him, but that would just create a power vacuum leading to someone even worse, right? That sums it up pretty well there. But without government, warlords would take over. Here's another one. One of the most common objections to the existence of a free society is the notion that in the absence of government, people would act in the utmost egregious and violent ways towards each other. Warlords, violent gangs, corporations run amok, and sociopathic individuals acting on their own accord would endlessly wreak havoc on society at large, and that nobody would keep them in check. This schizophrenic and historically illiterate notion completely ignores human history and the underlying causes for why human history has thus far been filled with instances of mass genocide, holocausts, human slavery, and orchestrated mass starvation, right? And then we have my favorite quote here by Robert Higgs, which perfectly summarizes why this argument is nonsense, right? Uh, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a whole lot of war that goes on in the presence of government. In fact, governments are the source of the vast majority of wars, and they are the ones that benefit off of those wars. If you have war, that gives the justification for the existence of the state because, oh my goodness me, what are we going to do about those evil people unless we have these massive militaries and police forces, etc., in order to protect us, right? So the war is the health of the state, as the quote goes. The more war there is, the more justification there is for the state, the better for the state, and the longer that it lasts. The state, that is. But without government, there would be no justice. So this is also a big one. At the center of the anarchist worldview is the idea that human rights are universal, meaning that all people have the same rights, and therefore earthly justice should be universal and equal as well. Government justice systems have been shown historically to act in diametrical opposition to the idea of the universalization of justice. Professor John Hasnas has described the futility of the attempts to universalize man's laws in his essay, The Myth of the Rule of Law. In it, he proves the futility of attempting to administer law through government and the wishful thinking of the proponents of justice systems who imagine that government impartially and equally implements its form of justice that presumably relies on the unilateral consent of the masses. You and I never consented to being governed. You and I never consented to all of the laws that are on the books in the government, right? Every individual person commits 3 to 4 felonies a day, if that gives you an idea, right? And that's not made up. That's true. The whole idea that this system is objective and it provides anything even closely resembling justice is just a fallacy. I just realized that my camera was blocking all of the text, so I moved it over to the side here. But without further ado, here. But without government, there would be no market regulation. It's another fallacy. There would be regulation, and there is regulation that is outside of the state even today, right? But so it goes. The argument goes: stores would sell defective goods, people would be poisoned left and right, cars would explode, airplanes would crash, slave labor, child labor. All of these are arguments that one might hear when arguing in favor of a truly free market, and indeed, none of them are decidedly substantiated, right? Free markets are fully capable of regulating themselves. The proof of this can be already found in current modern-day iterations of organizations that have the explicit goal of publicizing the effectiveness and quality of products and services on the market. These are commonly known as consumer reports and trade associations. Irrespective of their moral compass, people have a vested interest in purchasing goods and services that are cost-effective and of high quality. People don't want to buy products that were made with slave labor. There's already people that slave and child labor. There's already people that, don't want to do that, and they purposely boycott organizations that engage in such behavior, right? And we can, obviously that's a whole nother can of worms to open up when it comes to, sweatshops and that kind of thing, and I can make another video about that in the future. But just the entire idea of, right, if the government regulators were not to exist, right, if there was no centralized regulatory force, well, then, the airlines would just fly unsafe airplanes. There'd be airliner crashes left and right, right? Just, it seems as though people who make that argument don't sit to think, if this was the case, right, if there were airlines that did not care about the safety of their airplanes, right, and they only cared about their bottom, their bottom dollar, right? How long do you think an airline like that would exist before people would be like, you know what? I don't think the risk is the risk versus reward is kind of lopsided here. I don't think I'm gonna I think I'm going to go with option B over here, this other airline that cares more about their safety of their operation and whatnot, that they spend more time making sure that their airplanes are safe. Obviously those kinds of airlines, those kinds of firms that provide inferior products, that provide inferior services, or that provide those services in to provide those services or products in an inferior way, are ultimately gonna take a back seat to the companies and organizations that provide products and services that do so more efficiently, more morally, and more safely. But that just does not seem to enter the calculation, because the idea is that, if there is no centralized regulation, then obviously everything becomes less safe, and obviously everything becomes less efficient, and so on and so forth, right? Simply not true. Just economically speaking, it's not true, but that's the sort of prevailing sentiment out there, of people who put all of their trust in government regulation. Corporations would take over. Now, this one's kind of goes hand in hand with the whole power vacuum argument, right? While some statists acknowledge that the government is inherently violent, immoral, and inefficient, they still insist that it is a necessary evil, and that if government ceased to exist, corporations like Amazon, McDonald's, or Costco would take up the duty of forcibly subjugating the masses by instituting their own armies, police forces, and tax collectors. Excuse me. Aside from being the most outlandish concern for a society without a ruling class, this fear likely is only sincerely held by the least intelligent of critics of freedom. What differentiates government and all other social organizations is that government, in the minds of most people, has perceived authority, or the right to rule and issue commands that everybody in society must obey, regardless of whether they objectively did anything wrong or not. The amount of people that would legitimately believe that McDonald's has the right to forcibly subjugate, extort, hold under duress, and expropriate members of society under the color of the McClaw is not substantial enough for these companies to achieve the level of power that government wields, even if they manage to get a substantial following in that pursuit. Corporations are state inventions. The power they wield over their competitors and the people at large comes primarily from government. So this one's argued a lot by people, specifically, especially people who once have considered themselves libertarian or anarchists, and now have moved back into this sort of political paradigm, and they once again believe in voting, at least at the local level or whatnot, and they're clinging on to that belief. They look back and they say, well, people are so deluded that they would buy the idea that the McPolice has the right to subjugate them and to to levy the McTax or what have you, right? But I have a little bit more faith in humanity, in that I don't think that ultimately there's enough people who wouldn't buy that it wouldn't fly, so to speak. But who knows? Perhaps I'm wrong. There would be no rights without government. Human rights are bestowed by government. This is probably this central folly, the central mistake that most statists commit, is this folly, this idea that the government is the thing that gives people's rights. I mean, it's just the most horrific one that you hear people say. Human rights are not bestowed by government. They are not social constructs or subjective ideas created by humans that can readily be rescinded or redacted. They are bestowed by the creative force of existence, and they are inherent to being a human being. Now, whether you call it God, whether you call it the creative force that created everything, right? Whatever it is, that is the thing that has created objective morality and human rights, and those cannot be taken away, and more rights can't be given to somebody at will, right? So they are bestowed by the creative force of existence, and they are inherent to being a human being. No mortal being can bestow rights that they do not have inherently, and no mortal being has the right to take rights away from others. There is no such thing as authority vested in man. It is an impossibility. One person cannot say, oh, well, I've communicated with a whole bunch of my friends, and they all signed this piece of paper with fancy writing and this eagle seal right at the top that says I now get to extort you, and that be an actual thing, right? That's not an actual thing, and unfortunately, people have been duped into thinking that it is, right? People have been duped into thinking that, there's a divine right to rule, right? That was bestowed by God for the kings, and then ultimately that went away, and now we're under the spell of the democracy, right? This idea that just because a whole group of people, a whole majority of people say, yes, I agree to this system, I agree to being ruled over, therefore it's okay, right? Therefore this government has the moral right to exist and the moral right to issue commands and demands of its subjects, and to treat its subjects as human cattle as it sees fit, right? That is not true in the anarchist perspective, right? The anarchist realizes that each individual human has irrevocable rights that are inherent to their existence, and that it is immoral of any other person to stomp on those rights, right? And lastly, I got this nice quote here. The difference between mafia and government is that the mafia does not have a 15,000-hour system of indoctrination during your formative years to convince you that its activities are something other than organized crime. So anyways, that's the second episode of the Voluntary Planet podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sure there's plenty more arguments that I haven't talked about here in this presentation that go against the ideas of a stateless society. But if I find those, and if they come to mind, then I'll include them in a future episode. But for now, thank you for watching. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.